Hello, thanks for tuning in to my conversation with Justin Murphy. So I'll set a little context, but first, some house some housekeeping. So as always, my company, the Circling Institute, if you want to explore circling, we have an open evening on Thursday night, and we have a weekend coming up in a couple of weeks. Um, and then there's the year-long course that's also open for registration. So links for all that below. Also, if you want to work with me one-on-one, go just contact me over email, and that's below too. All right. So I've been looking forward to this conversation with Justin. I've really appreciated his work and what he's up to. And the conversation was really cool. It takes this interesting kind of almost like a fractal or a holographic kind of shift in the middle of it, where in some sense the subject of what we were talking about became in some sense what was talking, right? Um, and I appreciated how he acknowledged that, and then we kind of explored it. So it was a really, we covered a lot of ground. So I just had a really good time in this conversation, and I'm sure it's the first of perhaps many with him. All right, enjoy.
Way more thoughtfully and effectively.
Yeah.
So yeah, happy to talk about anything you'd like, really.
Sweet, sweet. And one of the things I've just appreciated about what I understand of your work, it's one, I really like your sense of humor.
Thank you. not everyone does, so I appreciate
really like your sense of humor. The one, the one you did about like the being in the suburbs, like, and then I think you talked about like being in the suburbs and how like, yeah, you know, you really don't have to leave the house, but yet there's nature just down the street, and and then you turn around and you're like, yeah, and I'm at my dad's, and then there's like this kind of trashy pickup truck and all these things. I'm from Chicago, grew up in the suburbs, raised in the suburbs, and the meta level that you were hitting in that video was so gorgeous. It was a work of art. So I'm
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
I'm appreciating your my sense of your awareness of the absurdity underneath these things that people just live in, it seems, without noticing how absurd it is. And you highlight that in your humor. I've just liked that about your videos. And also what you're trying to do, and my understanding is your transparency around also wanting to find a way to create a business, right, that also models, maybe, I don't know, is the word modeling out an escape from capture, right, in the Deleuzian language, right? And just having that project be transparent and you doing it and seeing your newsletters and the way that you're doing it, and then you want to help other people do that. So that's been fascinating to me.
Yeah, thank you for your interest, for sure. I mean, I think that through most of the history of the intellectual life, people have tried to find insulation from markets. That's what academia has always tried to offer. That's been the allure of academia, right? You get this kind of protected job by paying your dues, climbing the ranks, you become a prestigious professor, and then you pretty much don't have to worry about performing on the market. You can just basically do your work in a disinterested way. That's the ideal anyway, right? And it's somewhat similar for artists, right, who generally are looking for patrons and, you know, benefactors who can pretty much just pay for them to do their work, again, insulated from market pressures. That's always been one of the big orientations of intellectuals in Western civilization. And I think that's changing significantly now, because what people are realizing is that this is a kind of dependency in which the costs are increasingly visible and the benefits are increasingly outweighed by the benefits of just bootstrapping little commercially viable entrepreneurial ventures and experiments. I think you're seeing this especially with the new emerging experiments in crypto, where you have artists, both visual artists and musical artists, now only really quite recently, a non-trivial number of artists making non-trivial amounts of money on purely crypto-based platforms. So I think the tide is changing where some form of entrepreneurship and true independence is increasingly attractive to artists and intellectuals. And the more traditional forms of dependency are less and less attractive is
Right.
something that I think is going on right now in a pretty deep way.
Right. So what you're saying is like academia initially provided insulation from the markets with this idea that then it can go on without having to worry about being profitable. But that there's something about the way that those institutions, what the meaning of those institutions and the roles of those institutions now is like, it costs a lot. And so,
Absolutely.
right, these
Yeah.
outliers that wouldn't go to academia or that jump out of academia, it kind of, there's new niches for that, for them to actually make money and do crazy things and be more
Yep.
demonstrational in their what they want to say. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the costs that you pay for that kind of institutional dependence are increasing. You know, the the institutions take their pound of flesh, and that is increasingly onerous in the form of the cognitive taxation that occurs when there are all of these different tripwires you're not supposed to touch, essentially what people call political correctness. And it's not just political topics, it's a much more diffuse kind of professionalism, which pretty much impinges on people's ability to be free and creative is really what it's about. It's not just the political party lines, which there are, but it's much more diffuse and almost apolitical in a sense. It's just like to pursue professional career tracks as an intellectual, you have to be increasingly tight-lipped in every way, not just in political ways, and it's increasingly competitive. So the irony is that now, like, to be a professor, you have to pretty much submit to many years of doing nothing but competing on the market of the academic job market, basically. And then it's like, so the market pressures, which have always been, kind of creatively constraining, and that's why artists and intellectuals have always wanted to escape them. The irony is that all of that has been pushed to the pre-academic competitive race to get the positions that are supposedly insulated from the market. But actually the whole career becomes this kind of rat race where you're always competing on this institutionalized market, which is arguably more constraining and more fickle than the open market. And on the open market, we now have the situation where it's just everything is way more liquid. Payment facilities are now way more widespread. So people are just adapted to paying for things on their phone. And there's more and more people on their phones and on their desktops. And all that is just way more liquid and fluid. I think that's essentially the background factor for why doing things as an artist or an intellectual through basically entrepreneurial methods is increasingly easy and attractive and doesn't have the downsides of trying to win these institutional status games.
Right. As you're talking about, and the way that you're talking about this, I'm just struck by this just fascinates me. But and I think this maybe opens up a little bit of your relationship with philosophy and Deleuze. But this sense for example, when you talked about the institution, right, being originally there to kind of in some sense protect the domain of the intellectual life, that somehow there's pressures and forces that act on it, and these other things that act on it are also domains in which human beings have basically created, right? Like, all there wouldn't be without human beings, but yet at some point they get big enough or something, or they start to be their own entity that like works like a weather pattern works or something, and then we're strangely the ones that created it, keep it in existence, yet there's these points where it starts to create us and constrain us. That thing, what is that thing from your view?
Right. Yeah. Well, I think that when humans create institutions, as soon as they create institutions then have this causal effect back on humans. But so I think that's a kind of essential aspect of what institutions are.
Yeah.
But what happens is, I think at a certain point, the causal power of the institution over the individual becomes increasingly great. And I think we're just currently living through this epoch where it's now becoming just palpably, undeniably great.
Yeah.
And it's really only becoming visible in contrast to the very different space or vista that opens up to those who break out of the institution, basically.
Yeah.
So it's like when there were no other options, it was just, the power, the causal dominating power of these big modern bureaucratic institutions was easy to kind of lose track of. It was easy to just be swimming in it and just kind of it recedes into the background of everyday life. But now you have this new opportunity now, which we talked about a minute ago, which is increasingly visible. There are increasingly more and more case studies of people breaking out of institutions and going completely independent through entrepreneurial methods and doing very well. Now that throws into relief, wow, these big bureaucratic institutions have constrained us more than we ever realized that they were, in a way. But I think that's essentially, it goes back to, it goes back probably to Faust. I mean, I think like institutions are these bargains with the devil in a way. Yeah. In modernity, we build institutions so that we can move large sums of capital and large sums of bodies in this kind of corporate organized way. The only way to run something like the modern institution of the school or the modern institution of the corporation, these big aggregated modern institutions that define modernity, really, the only way to do that is through these big bureaucratic institutions. Right. And we got a lot of economic growth out of that. We got a lot of value out of that, and that's why we pursued it. But we didn't fully understand that we were making a bargain with the devil, and that these would then turn around and be, controlling us or oppressing us to a degree that we didn't even fully appreciate. So I think it's just a basic theory of the institution. That's how institutions always work. And then over time, the causal power of the institution increases as the agency of the individual decreases.
Right. Would it be fair to say that what kept that at check historically seems like it would be, what is Christianity's role in this? Like, I would imagine that in some ways that's what made Christianity what it was, is in some level this way that it worked with the power structures and the institutions. Even though itself was an institution, there's something Christianity was doing that seemed to relate to this somehow. Or
it's a good question. I would not put too much stock into my views on this. I have very idiosyncratic and kind of wild card theories about Christianity, but I'm not very theologically or on this front historically sophisticated. So that is a caveat. I do sometimes talk about how it seems to me that the Catholic Church in particular seems to have been pre-programmed with a kind of purpose, whether this is conscious or not. I've always seen the historical Catholic Church as this very clever device for kind of absorbing into itself a lot of the problems of human organization, almost like a martyr wants to absorb himself the sins of other people or something like this. I've always kind of seen the Catholic Church as this institution that is basically kind of saying, look, there's all these problems with human institutions, right? Let's just put them all on our shoulders. Let's shoulder these problems in this one large, somewhat authoritarian, kind of Christian institution, so that the human beings within it can be relatively free of these problems in their own lives and in their own families and in their own kind of autonomous, fluid organizations or assemblies. And so that's one theory I've always kind of toyed with.
So they kind of, in some sense, took on the burden.
In a way, right. Yeah. I mean, in some, like, instead, so what we have in the modern period is basically the institutions that Foucault analyzes, right? The hospital, the school, the prison. These are all what he calls disciplinary institutions. And that's what I was referring to before as kind of the classic modern institutions. They're big, they aggregate bodies and resources and capital, and they create these grids of intelligibility to basically operate at very large scale. And those institutions, or what Foucault calls disciplinary, the disciplinary society, the modern classical institutions, is in some way a kind of proliferation of the oppressive aspects of institutions. It's like we could just put all of what's wrong with institutions in like one big institution, and then we all be relatively free to organize, autonomously in our own lives with families and stuff like that. But what we actually have is like a whole bunch of churches, basically, all of which have the problems of institutions, and all of which encroach on an increasing number of our aspects of our life. Right. So that's kind of how I see it. I think that, if you just if everyone could defer to like one true church, that was invested with the authority to basically represent God.
Right.
Then sure, that's going to have problems for sure. It's going to tend towards a certain kind of oppressiveness. It's going to have corruption. It's going to have abuse of power inevitably, because we are fallen creatures. But theoretically, there is a kind of way you could understand that as containing and limiting the power of corrupt institutions to encroach on our lives, as long as it could be. So I mean, again, I'm kind of riffing on the edges of what I think about this. I don't know how much that really adds up, but it does seem to me that you could have that kind of situation, and then in our own lives and our friendships, our families, it's basically free of all of these kind of nastier aspects of institutions, which in the modern period actually tend to proliferate and seep into more and more aspects of our life. Is kind of how I think about it.
Yeah, totally. It's fascinating to think about, because because there is this dichotomy I noticed with that. So, for example, Zuckerberg, right? I always kind of look at him and I'm like, I bet if we sat down and talked, he's like going to say something like, dude, I have no idea what to do with all of this. Right? Like, I have no idea. Like, there's this kind of way in which I think what you're talking about, this sense where there's no longer a separation between, no matter what the intention is of the person in the institution, once it gets to a certain degree of power or whatever, you watch it do these malevolent kind of things, right? In a certain sense, like independent of the will of the people running it, which is striking to me.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that is the story of modernity in a way. It's the institutions that we create to provide us a value take on a life of their own, and now become the masters who basically dictate our attitudes and behaviors on a daily basis. And but I think the digital revolution is increasingly representing vectors of escape from that. It's just still very new. I mean, the digital revolution is extremely new still. We're still in the absolute infancy of it. And that's how I think about it.
Oh, yeah. It's scary to think we're in the absolute infancy of it. Like, to watch. That is scary to watch, because I don't even think that we can perceive the changes that have already happened from it. I don't even know if we can literally see it, even if we're looking straight at it. This is part of what I feel like circling kind of is a response to at some level, right?
Yeah. So tell me more about that then. I mean, how do you see like circling, your conception of circling, which is, I'm sure your audience already knows about this, so you don't need to go over it. But how do you see the practice of circling fitting into the digital age?
Well, I'm not sure if I see it or not, right? Because I've been continually impressed with what I can't see. So with that said, a little setup with it is, I think there was a huge dramatic change that's gone unacknowledged, right? And I think it started, I think the first essence of it was the answering machine, right? The answering machine was the first time where all of a sudden you can exchange information without having to relate. And relationship, if you think about the social ritual of the most simple conversation, if you see into the possibilities of wonder and horror that can happen, like you could say something to me that could change my life. That's absolutely true and enlighten me. Or you could say something that would put everything I do in doubt just by making noises in a conversation, right? That's why I think conversation is filled with so much ritual and repetition, is to deal with that ambiguity, right? But then as we started to get into texting and we started to get into all these ways where you separate communion from like communication, right? You no longer have to commune, and you make it an option to not have to go through this channel. At least we had to make a phone call, back, pre 80s. You had to talk on the phone. Well, that talking is the very way one becomes a self in the world, right? It's like dealing with another's face and all of the coming into being and responding and socialization that happens, that is the result of you being a self that you can know about, right?
Mm-hmm.
We've eliminated and made most of those optional, and they're inherently terrifying. They're just terrifying. They've never not been terrifying, right? They're just as terrifying as they've always been, but we've never had the option. And so like everywhere else, you see these multiplications of ways of not having to relate with anybody, but yet still be connected to them in some way. And so circling happened to be something where we just basically took, you could say, circling is something like if you were to take all of the profound, deep, intimate, life-changing conversations that you've ever had in connections, and you were to abstract out the underlying asanas that made those possible. Circling is like getting together and like going into those asanas, like one does a yoga class. So it basically made the fundamental I vow unit of relation a practice that people started to do. But that happened right as technology and all these systems are coming into play. And then it took me a while to realize like what we were actually doing. I'm like, oh, this is right. We now are in the situation that put our bodies in the same position after the Industrial Revolution, which was we didn't have to move anymore. We now have gyms. We have artificial environments in which to move. It transformed even what the body was to us, right? And so now we have to go and have domains in which we only have that concern. And so I think something similar is happening with relationship. And I think circling happened. Why? Because I've always asked myself, why is it like two dorks, right, out in the desert, like total with no business sense, like two wingnuts, start this has this experience and then it goes around the world. I think it has to do with what it touches in on, is this kind of some kind of form of escaping capture, but also practicing what technology has eliminated a lot of, which is tolerating the ambiguity in that you need to become a character in the world, right?
Right. Yeah, I love that. Totally. So I'm happy to talk about anything you want. Can I ask you a
Yeah,
few more questions
sure.
about, I'm kind of curious about the business side of circling. Like, is it like a registered trademark? Is there a business operation there? Or like, because I know
Yeah.
nothing, but I'm quite curious.
Yeah, like, well, different people do it differently. There's a few different schools, right, that have broken off and kind of done their own thing with it. So it's like I think in some sense it being free going Wild West seemed to be important for it in the beginning. But what's interesting to me is I think now, and this is kind of starts to get into what you're talking about. I think now the thing I started noticing is that people were calling what they were doing circling, that I'm like, that's not circling. And I'm like, wait a minute, if this keeps going, the word circling is going to have no meaning at all. And then the
Right.
whole history of what we went through is not going to hold. That's a problem, right? And so we're right in the middle of figuring out how to address that, right? So we're looking at, like, we're basically looking at, we took three of the major schools and we're kind of we're right now in the middle of creating a structure to hold it, like to possibly trademark it, hold the trademark and vote on things and bring people into it and still get that novelty that comes in, but also somehow holds the integrity of the name, right? So it means something. So,
Right.
but I'm very
Makes
aware
sense.
of that. Like it's a tricky process of like, because there is just, no matter how good our intentions are, you can see with corporations that it can just turn, right, and become
Right.
captured, like indistinct from you. So I go into
Right.
that with great caution.
But at the moment, there's no kind of business operation attached to it.
Well, there's like my business operation, which is we have circling nights. People come to it. It's all online now.
Oh,
We
right.
do weekends, and then there's like a year-long training and 3 levels of training around it. It's become, in some sense, I think a lot of people that end up doing it, it actually becomes like in some sense, a spiritual practice for them. It evokes a
Mm,
lot of the similar things, like the way meditation does for people. They kind of
totally
relate
makes
to it
sense.
as a practice. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, totally makes sense. Cool.
So courses and a little bit like what you're doing online. Well, a lot like what you're doing online, right? Where it's just
Yeah.
like put stuff out there. People are attracted to it. We have a practice group that they come and meet it. We go on Zoom, and then we have weekends that go deeper into it. Where we go into the distinctions and how to do it and all that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Very cool. Very cool. So what else?
See, with circling.
Oh no, just
Oh
it's the
yeah.
first time you and I have talked, so I'm just kind of curious
Oh yeah.
what else you think we might,
Totally.
productively exchange about.
Well, I'd love to hear more about your, like, just your personal experience with because my understanding is you had a job as a professor and
Yeah.
went through the ranks of that and got a position as a professor, right?
Yeah.
And then left it. I'd love to hear a little bit about how that worked and what that was like and why you left. And
Yeah, totally. It's a pretty crazy story, honestly. So I finished my PhD in 2014, and I was always dead set on breaking into academia and becoming a professor. That was all I ever really wanted since I was, probably about 20. And I gave all of my 20s to basically trying to achieve that goal. And I was like 27 in 2014. I got my PhD, and then I got very, very lucky I got a tenure track job at a good university in England. That was the only catch. But I mean, the market is so competitive that if you want to be a professor with a legit kind of research-based job where you don't have to teach that much and you don't have to do, grueling other kinds of labor, and it's mostly you're there to do research and teach a little bit, then it's really, I mean, those jobs are incredibly hard to get. It's one of the most competitive career tracks. Just if you look at the number of PhDs that come out each year and the number of
yeah,
actual job openings, I won the lottery, really. I mean, I was good for sure.
mm-hmm.
So I earned it, but there were lots of very good people who don't get jobs. So
Mm-hmm.
quite a lot of luck. I won the lottery and got this really good job. And so I moved to England, and make a long story short, I did well. Like I kept my mouth shut and was very well behaved and like worked super hard, kept my head down, published, in prestigious journals and did everything right. And I was like, I think it's fair to say I was kind of like a rising star in my field in that little niche that I was in England. And so I did everything right and I was doing really well. But at a certain point, I tried to make good on the promise that academia represents, which is when you pay your dues and you get established and you get that, secure, that famously secure job, the tenured professor, then I was going to start taking my liberties because I've always been that type of person. I mean, from the day that I decided I wanted to be a professor, it was only as a means to my vision of what the intellectual life is and should be and must be, which is basically radically unconstrained intellectual freedom and courage of expression. And that was the only reason I ever wanted to be a professor, is basically so I could do the most intellectual work over the course of my life as possible, in the most intense and honest and impactful way possible. That was always the call. That's always been my calling. I just wanted to be a professor because it seemed to be the best way to do that. And for maybe some time, and for many years, that was the case. But it just became increasingly clear to me that this job was not going to allow me to really maximize my potential in terms of
Mm.
living living the rest of my life doing genuine research and writing and speaking to the highest ability that I knew I could achieve. It just was increasingly painfully obvious to me every passing year. I was a professor for about 5 years, and I was tenured in the British version of that term, which is a little bit different. But I basically could have had that job for life if I wanted it. It was increasingly clear that, I mean, I was spending most of my time doing paperwork and doing like all kinds of inane stuff. And I very much enjoyed the people I was working with. Like, I have nothing bad to say about my colleagues, and my department was relatively cool. But it was just radically disappointing and disillusioning, the overarching experience and structure that academia had become, basically. And yeah, so that's pretty much, I mean, there's a whole other bunch of details. I mean, I am a somewhat provocative person in general. I like to be, I'm very kind of, I just have a creative temperament, a kind of anarchistic temperament. So that was definitely a problem. Like, repeatedly, I was slowly kind of building a sheet of like little violations and infractions of things that are,
like what was an example of that? Like, I was wondering how that temperament like worked in that constraint.
Yeah, it goes back to what I was saying before, that it's not even political. It's more just little random infractions of professionalism that, to me, is just a necessity for like a creative, honest person living creatively and freely. But that just does, to the professional mold, is just kind of, they look askance at it. So like, I remember probably the first thing that I got in trouble for was, looking back on it, this was kind of the beginning of the end, probably, but it seemed very trivial at the time. I went to Amsterdam with my wife for a weekend, just a little holiday, a little weekend getaway. And as you do in Amsterdam, we ate psychedelic mushrooms, and because it's basically legal there, and we had like a lovely time. We were just hanging out in our hotel room, tripping on mushrooms together. And I made a few like Instagram videos of myself, like while I was tripping on mushrooms, and basically just talking. And they were actually really cute videos. Like, they were fun, happy, just kind of, they're actually really nice videos. Like like art, they were like somewhat artful. I look back and
I could feel the pride.
And I got reprimanded for that. As soon as I got back, they were like, you're a professor, can't be doing drugs on the internet. And I'm like, well, okay, it's basically legal there. So there's not an ethical, there's nothing ethically problematic about it. Even scientific research is increasingly showing these to be good substances and very promising in many ways. And I don't really see any, like, no one got hurt. There was nothing negative. I didn't say anything bad. So like in every dimension I could see, there was just nothing ethically dubious at all. And so they wanted me to take down those videos. And I like, as a professional intellectual, it is my job to not do things that don't make sense. You know what I mean? It's like, I feel that as soon as you start making compromises about what is true and good, then you're not really ever going to be a real philosopher or scientist, basically. And that's what I was saying before. Like that, I guess, I don't know, maybe I think people, a lot of my colleagues would maybe say that I'm naive or ridiculous or whatever, but I really do see the calling of the intellectual to be this really uncompromising, all or nothing type of proposition. Like, you're either going to seek the truth, you're either going to use your life to seek the truth and express it courageously and fully, or you're not. And if you don't want to, that's completely fine, but you can't really be a true intellectual or accomplish anything significant as a thinker if you're not going to go all in. And so that was like just that's a trivial example, but that's why it's a good example, because that's what I mean. It's like, those are the little ways they start chipping away at your soul, and like, you're not actually going to be able to be the radically honest, radically kind of like public intellectual that I think needs to be the calling of any intellectual worth their salt. And so that's just one example. There are some others, but I think that's kind of that was kind of the most revealing one, because it's so trivial, but I think in a revealing way.
Did everyone who protested about that, I get this picture of like that person again. I keep wondering about this distinction. The person that was actually saying that didn't actually care.
Oh, of course. Of course.
But they're referencing some them or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that what you mean by the diffuse nature of it? Yeah.
That's right. It's Lacan's concept of the big other. Everyone is worried about the big other. Like, and so any little infraction of
Yeah.
professionalism in these institutions, every single human being you interact with is going to say, of course, I understand it's no big deal. Of course, I
Yeah.
understand those were perfectly nice, wholesome videos and you
Yeah.
did nothing wrong.
Yeah.
But then what they're also going to say is, you know, it's just not a good look. These types of euphemisms, right? It's like,
Yeah.
what will people think? That's not the image we want to give off. And so everyone is referring to this big other that you
Yeah.
can't actually find anywhere.
Right. Right. Totally. So that's one of the things about this time right now, that it's so difficult to pin down, right? Like, exactly. Because it's weird. You try to isolate it, and you point at it and it kind of disappears or dissipates or something like that. It's really hard to find someone, especially in these conversations about like the radical left and like political correctness and all these people that are protesting. You can see them from a certain scale. They're protesting about this, but you never. I've yet to hear like somebody say, "I am a Marxist and I'm here to destroy the country through." And that's what I'm doing, right? Like, it's a strange, this, whatever that is very interesting to me,
Right.
because it seems
Yeah,
like
totally.
it gets into the unsaid, right? Like all of a sudden at that level of where you just know that's bad manners if you cross this line, and you just know you got to be careful to say this to that, like in this way that just gets communicated. I don't know what that is. What is that thing that just knows, like, that you can get in trouble if you go to other countries because your intuitions are off about that stuff, right? But
Right.
whatever that is, just being careful. Like, well, in my own experience of like, I'm very aware that for the first time in my life that I'm white and I lead courses, and there's all of these places where I find myself being cautious and careful about things that I haven't consciously thought about, that like just the year before I wouldn't have even been cautious about, right? Or known to be cautious about. That's what's interesting to me, and that's what seems a little bit dangerous, is the way it becomes diffuse and the way it becomes whatever that stuff is in. I'm responding to it, but I've never thought about it explicitly. In fact, no one's ever told it to me explicitly, but I'm living inside of.
Right. Absolutely. But what's interesting about it is to note that it is very constrained to institutions. It's endemic to institutions, but thankfully, it does seem to be only operative really
Yeah.
in institutions.
Right.
So this is what is
Hmm.
promising. And
Hmm.
and I think it goes back to what we were saying before. Institutions
Hmm.
are these structures that we create to serve us,
Yeah.
but we pay a price for that. And the price of that is that we now, once you have institutions serving you, you also have these symbolic structures that hover over the heads of all
Hmm.
the individuals involved.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
people have to pay homage to those symbolic structures,
Yeah.
even if things change and it becomes such that all of the individuals reject certain aspects of the symbolic structure because maybe they're outdated, maybe they don't make sense anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
But those symbolic structures still exert forces. They're still effective
Right.
in demanding and commanding the respect of the agents who are operating within those institutions. But what's really interesting to see is that what succeeds outside of institutions is precisely the opposite. And this is where it's quite promising and exciting to me, because the same exact things that I naturally inclined to do as just a creative, truth seeking person that got me in trouble within the institutions were the same things that my fans on the internet really were interested in and liked about me and admired about me.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
this goes under many euphemisms today, like people call it authenticity or like personality or whatever. But it is basically true that precisely what is penalized within the institutions due to these kind of symbolic structures that people find increasingly oppressive in the institutions is precisely what rises to the top
Yeah.
outside of institutions. And
Right.
I think people need to see that more clearly, because it's quite reproducible. It's quite consistent. This is a kind of, there are a set of laws here that are really, that you can count on. It's not as whimsical and unpredictable as people think. It is actually as simple as and reproducible as individuals can reflect on what are the things I want to say and do that this institution is going to penalize me for?
Hmm.
Okay, those are exactly the things that if I do them on the internet, I can accrue an organic audience of people who respect me and admire me and are interested in me for doing those things. I
Yeah.
think it's way more reproducible and consistent than people realize.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, totally. Well, yeah, you're right. I got that sense of where the moment it's out of the institution, I got this picture of like, oh yeah, you're right there. Here we are talking. Like people are, and there's none of those constraints. There's just a kind of a playful, animating goodness or something that comes about, right? That's just, yeah, you're right. It's like the moment you're outside of the institution, that constraint's gone. So it's like right there. Huh. Speaking of that, the thing I've been curious about also is one is I wasn't able to attend you and Johannes's last lecture, right, or your last course together. And I was really struck by the thing about how Johannes, without you caught this in the when you at the first conversation where you caught him using Deleuzian language right before
Yeah,
he
that's
was
cool.
really even recognizing it, right, in that moment. You're like, oh, it's good to see you've been like you drank the Kool-Aid a bit, right? um I'm just curious, like the working with him with some of the deeper Heidegger work with that, like how has that influenced your thinking on a lot of this stuff and what you've, if it has, this stuff around technology and capture, and in what way are you seeing things more so or less so or differently or
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, Johannes's brand of Heideggerianism has definitely rubbed off on me in a few ways, but I haven't quite stopped to reflect on how exactly. So it's an interesting, challenging question. Well, I guess I could answer this by working through just some of the vocabulary that has naturally kind of been imparted to me. So one thing my mind always goes back to is Johannes likes to talk about this will to will. I like that a lot. That because that characterizes quite well, I think, the institutions as I've been kind of using this term
yeah,
in this conversation. When I was saying before how institutions come to take a life of their own, and before we know it, we're all in this modern predicament where most people, anyone who works for any type of large bureaucratic organization, is essentially following orders, dictates that are coming down from on high, and
mm-hmm.
no one really, you know, necessarily likes them
Yeah,
or necessarily originates them,
yeah,
but everyone is basically following these orders of an institution, and the question becomes, where is this institution really going?
yeah,
And I think Heidegger gives us some resources for thinking that through, because the essence of modern technology is this constant deferral of the meaning of what we're doing in favor of just doing the enhancement, the
yeah,
power's enhancement of itself, essentially,
right,
in this
right,
in this kind of nihilistic way. I
right,
do think that's essentially what is the predicament of institutions. Essentially, institutions are increasing their own power at the cost of human agency, really, and where it's going, none of us know. It's just the will to will. It's the institutions increasing their own power for their own sake, more or
yeah,
less. And
yeah,
this is kind of baked into the nature of modern technology in some sense.
yeah,
And I think Heidegger gives us some resources for that. And I just really like that phrase, the will to will,
mm,
which comes through Nietzsche also. So yeah, I think, what else have I learned from Johannes? Well, I definitely think the themes of concealing and unconcealing,
mm-hmm.
and truth as
Yeah,
aletheia is very useful and
yeah,
quite interesting to me. I've kind of adopted some of that terminology, which I've gotten
yeah,
from Johannes
yeah,
through Heidegger, namely in that, today the professional kind of institutionalized individual is basically very, very fake. And in trying to be something, one is always, kind of hiding something else. I
yeah,
think it's very easy to see that motif in modern society a lot, and I think it's quite revealing. And there's a kind of Deleuzian spin on this also, which Giannis and I have kind of noted in our collaborations, where Deleuze and Guattari talk about this idea of becoming imperceptible. And it's a phrase I really like, and I talk about it a lot, because basically, when you're trying to basically insert yourself into contemporary grids of legibility
Right.
when you're, trying to speak in public in a way that people appreciate and understand and like. You're very liable to being captured just in that very process, because in trying to be legible and liked, you are essentially submitting yourself to what Heidegger calls standing reserve. In a way, you're turning yourself into an object to be consumed and exploited more or less by the kind of status quo symbolic order. And so to really be free and to really create something new and to find your own genuinely creative vista, one has to prepare in advance to be misunderstood, or not even misunderstood, but to be completely imperceptible, really. And that at the height of creative freedom, one is essentially imperceptible. It's almost in a technical sense, completely nonsensical to all people. That's almost the definition of what is new. But to be able to follow through on it and create something meaningful out of it that sustains and endures. I think Deleuze is a master of this kind of puzzle. It's one of the things he's most interested in, and I think you see these themes of concealing and unconcealing in that puzzle. So yeah, I could riff a little bit more on some Deleuzean Heideggerian overlaps, which were really quite surprising to us because we didn't necessarily plan for that. But those are, I guess, like an inkling of some of the things that Johannes has really helped me think more about via Heidegger.
Just the presencing that thing you just said about the imperceptible and the creative, that there's a point where they kind of become the same thing, right? And there is a way where when you put your stuff out on the internet, it's not that you're going to be seen, it's that you're not going to be seen, right? And this weird way that exposes that's really interesting. I haven't heard talked about a lot, but I had Peugeot on here, and he thought he just went with it with me, but I it was the most offended I heard. Most criticisms of me about that interview was I was tripping out on, like, how the hell could Jesus, what was it like to be Jesus walking around saying those things when by nature he was saying things that nothing about the intelligibility and the horizons of understanding at that time could have made sense. So what was it like to be Jesus saying, like, turn the other cheek, right? Where it's like people don't even recognize people as people at that time, right? And he's saying these, or that I am God, and how he would even understand what he's saying, right? In some sense. I often wondered about that, like how something in Christ, with Christ, we could very much say that he, like, whatever it is that he said, at least had a lot to do with moving a whole way of making sense of the world that we're still frankly inside of, right? Without even having to know where it comes from, right? A lot of our values are deeply Christian, right? I think it's like as Paul would say, it's like the Christianity is like the arm, and now modernity is something like the fingers that don't recognize the arm of Christianity, of where it comes from. So just that sense, it's one of the things that just came up about, like, how does it, just a new form of intelligibility come into being, right? And how do the people around them understand it at the time? By definition, it's kind of impossible to understand.
Yeah, I think the case of Kurt is an interesting case study on this question, insofar as I see what you're saying, that the great prophets kind of emerge on the scene, saying many things that are perhaps vexing and seemingly confusing to normal people, but also saying and doing things that are immediately obviously resonant also. You know what I mean? So it's like a prophet is not going to be successful if they're truly, obviously they need to connect with the audience to some degree. Right. So, but I think, I do think that Christ is a pretty interesting case study, because in the Gospels of Mark, there's this very interesting few lines where Peter says to Christ, he says, I'm paraphrasing, but he basically says, yo, do you really need to like say all this stuff within earshot of the police? You know, it's like you're really asking for it, dude. They're gonna come for your neck. You know that, right? And Peter's basically admonishing Christ to, you know, you can say what you want and definitely, you know, preach your gospel on the country, you know, across the countryside or whatever. But maybe just be a little bit more judicious, you know, because you don't want the police to hear, right? They're gonna kill you, dude. Like maybe just chill out a little bit more judicious, right? And what Christ says in return is, and again, I'm paraphrasing like wildly, but this is just my kind of interpretation of it. Is he basically says, well, that's kind of the point. He says that one needs to speak the truth provocatively enough, actually, that you do trigger the authorities, because that's going to happen eventually, and that's actually part of the process. Is and what I find very interesting about that passage, and the reason I know it well, is that he uses a very particular term that links up the Christian project with a whole lineage in history of philosophy that I'm a big fan of and very interested in. Jesus Christ, in that passage in Mark, uses the term parousia. And parousia is a term that means, it translates into something roughly like frank speech. But it has connotation. So basically, it's like what we today call free speech, but not just free speech. It's kind of particularly provocative speech that is going to incur a cost on the speaker. That's really what parousia means. And one of the first truly parousiastic philosophers, parousia is a Greek term, and the first great parousiastic philosopher in ancient Greece was Diogenes, who, if your audience doesn't know, basically was this kind of wild performance artist type philosopher who lived like a homeless man, more or less, had basically very, very simple material needs, and was very smart and outspoken, but basically lived like a homeless man and went around basically barking at normal people, making fun of them for their, bourgeois, compromises. And preaching a life of radical simplicity and radical honesty. That's essentially like almost living like an animal, basically. So anyway, I have lots of riffs on that, but the reason I mention that is just that Jesus Christ is in this radical free speech tradition that is self-conscious about the necessity to incur punishment for the truths that one speaks. And that links up very, very nicely with what I was saying before about the, what is today euphemistically called the creator economy. But basically, you have all these people defecting from corrupt institutions, building viable, impactful kind of brands that are essentially trafficking in the same mechanism of parousia.
Right. Interesting. Yeah, you're right. This also brings you're a Christian, right?
Yeah.
You're a practicing Christian. That's cool. I'd love to.
Yeah,
I've enjoyed hearing you talk a little bit about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not a good Christian. I'm not like one of these Jonathan Pageau guys who I don't know anything. I'm not smart about it. I'm theologically extremely unsophisticated. And I have, my own kind of weird idiosyncratic, overly intellectualized, understanding of it. So I definitely don't present myself as any kind of like good Christian or even particularly smart Christian. My attitude is basically like, when I look at the whole set of ideas, I'm just like, this seems basically true. And of all of the kind of truly overarching philosophies of life that have emerged on the human scene, that have attempted to basically provide a completely holistic picture of what the human condition is and what is the right way to think and act. As far as I can tell, Christianity is the most impressive and convincing philosophy at that scale. So that's what I mean when I say I'm a Christian. Like, I think it's true. I think Christianity is true now because that's how it looks to me. But there are many aspects of it that I don't fully understand, especially the dogmas around, the various miracles and the various aspects that are difficult to integrate to a modern rational judgment. But my attitude towards that and my philosophy towards that is, I don't say anything that I don't think is true. but I do think that there are mysteries in life. That's just a basic fact of life. Like there are things we can't process, and the most
Yeah.
rational, hard-nosed, scientific, modern attitude has to certainly admit there are questions we don't have answers to. That's permissible and actually required, I would argue, from a rational perspective, to basically admit that. And then the second step of my reasoning is basically that if we are confronted with questions that we do not have compelling rational answers to, we nonetheless have to make guesses about what the right answer is, even if rationality leaves us woefully unguided on what is the true answer. We nonetheless have to make our own bets on what is the true answer. And to me, this is what faith means, essentially, is that when I look at Christianity, it seems true in many impressive ways. Then there are mysteries I don't understand, but I am going to basically just trust that those mysteries make sense in some way that I don't fully understand. And that's what faith is, I think, to me. And so I'm not reducing faith to rationality, but I do think that there is a rational decision to adopt faith on these larger questions that we otherwise can't answer. And I have chosen to place my faith in Christianity because it seems the most true kind of overarching philosophy I've encountered.
Yeah. Yeah. How do you go about practicing it?
Well, I'm a Catholic, but again, I'm incredibly unsophisticated. Like when I'm very honest about it, I have to kind of admit that it's probably just because my parents are Catholic and I was raised Catholic. Like I was brought up through Catholic day school, and I kind of I jumped through all the hoops. Well, that's a rude way of saying like the sacraments, but I was confirmed and stuff like that. So I was basically raised into the church, not devoutly, like my parents are not like very serious about it, but I do come from a kind of Irish Catholic family, and being honest about it, I'm probably a Catholic in large part just because it's a way of me kind of paying homage to my family and for identity background reasons. But so yeah, I couldn't give you like strong theological reasons, but that's kind of the truth of it. I try to be like extremely modest on this stuff because I don't rep myself as like, well, also frankly it's because I think like there's a lot of intellectual arrogance, and I think like our world is very poisoned by a kind of intellectual pride. And I mean, I'm about as intellectual as they come. I have a PhD and like I'm a pretty smart dude, and I believe strongly in when it comes to faith and religion. I really do believe strongly in a kind of true humility where you kind of just throw up your hands and you say like I'm a Christian not because I have super smart, convincing like philosophies and theologies, but almost the opposite. I'm a Christian because I'm fucking confused and I don't really know, but I'm just gonna like trust it's true. Like I think that's the most humble way to think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So interesting. It's so funny how actually what you're talking about that, and then when I look at, because me and my wife have contemplated having more kids. Well, I would have more kids. It would be our first kids, and trying to rationalize that is just there is no. I think I even heard you talk about that once. You cannot justify it rationally, right?
Right.
Having a kid. That one was quite an exercise. But also, it's hard for me when I look at the other end of this is when I look at like, okay, so if we have one, and I think about, well, what am I releasing them in? If I just kind of like let go, what are the institutions in which that will ultimately raise them? I'm like, all I see are video games, right? Like corner store, video marts, like I don't know, virtual reality. So I've been more like, it almost seems to me that religion at that point, relate like raising them in a religion, seems a lot more viable, a lot more rational, right? Than not, right? Because I'm like, what's the alternative? If you look at like, oh, something consistent that has a unifying story that people are really dedicated to, that brings people together in a unified way, that's like, they can kind of attach to and separate from. And and you have a story that if it doesn't make sense, it's housed within other stories, right, that do make sense, and having that live through the structures of your being and your rituals versus, the alternative. I don't know. That just it's hard to
Totally.
justify not being Christian in that sense.
Totally. Oh, I completely agree with that. But to me, that like what you just outlined is really enough of a warrant to literally just say you're Christian to be a Christian, right?
Yeah.
Because it's like if if you can say that, it looks like the best way to raise a child, then you probably think it's true on some level, right? And I'm not talking to you directly. I'm just
Mm-hmm.
saying I
Mm-hmm.
meet a lot of people like this who basically are kind of like they'll tell me at length all these ways in which Christianity seems really smart and like and really good. and
Mm-hmm.
and then I'll ask them like, oh, so are you a Christian? And they'll say like no, or let's say all these like different qualifying, things
Mm.
about how like no, not really, they're not Christians. And I'm like,
Yeah.
as far as I can tell, you're a Christian. Like if you think this is like a better philosophy than the other available ones, then
Mm-hmm.
you do think it's true more or less, and you are Christian. So
Yeah.
I think we have a very weird issue in our culture today where it's like if you're smart and
Yeah.
educated and a kind of intellectual person, it's people understandably have a lot of like reservations about identifying with
Yeah.
religions, and
Yeah.
I completely get and respect all of that. But to me, I think that those 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 hesitations and qualifications and the hangups people have about actually embracing a faith, investing in that faith and owning it and going deeper into it, those are kind of late modern, kind of bourgeois,
Yeah.
intellectualized, like overly intellectualized, like brain poisons that we all
Yeah.
struggle with, and which I also have as much as anyone.
Oh yeah.
Is how I think about it.
Yeah. And also I was wondering about this this relationship to mystery, right? This kind of relationship between that which you can think and that which is somehow mysterious or evades thought, right?
Mm-hmm.
I like whatever that point where those two things intersect is where it seems to me philosophy or philosophia in that way one is awakened to philosophy, right? Not the sense in like the way one is we were talking about earlier. And I'd love to hear your experience around this because I sense that you've had this through reading philosophy. But it does seem to me that what's possible, especially in these longer form conversations, it seems to evoke this with people. That's what I've been told about these conversations that I've been participating in, that Johannes has and Vervaeke, this sense in which there these longer form conversations that can hone into distinctions, philosophical distinctions, and actually awaken and become more than the sum of the people talking, right? That point where it lifts up and you have that Alethian moment, right? Is a way that where I feel that philosophy from a purely academic sense seems to me like a conversation that you could have or not. But in the deeper sense, it seems to me just maybe like religion is, right? It's questionable whether or not you can not have that conversation, right? I mean, there's a good argument that's saying that like even being atheist is a religious decision, right? That on some level, whether or not you have the conversation explicitly, you're always having the conversation at a deeper level. Um, and this sense of right I'm just curious about your experience with the way that philosophy can maybe like open up the unsayable, right? Yet 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 withdraw like make it unsayable but somehow make it present at the same time, right?
Yeah.
How that lives for you, what is it like reading philosophy and in some sense being a philosopher, and uh, the sense of mystery that you can kind of touch on in those deeper moments of philosophia, so to say.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a penetrating and challenging question. You know, I do sometimes have this mental model in my mind where if you really want to get at the truth of something, you're gonna have your sights on it, and you're gonna go after it, and you have to go after it directly and recklessly. But also, you're never gonna hit the bullseye. What you're gonna end up doing is kind of swirling around it. And that's kind of that's what a mystery is. And most of the great questions and challenges in the history of philosophy have this kind of mystery structure, as is the case with a lot of the deep truths in religions such as Christianity.
Yeah.
So again, I do think that the great world religions kind of encode this fact of life in organizing themselves around these kind of mystery propositions or these mystery events. Because what any the most hard-nosed rational philosopher or scientist will attest to what I'm saying in their own work, right? The best and the greatest and most hard-nosed philosophers and scientists spend their life thinking, and most of them will say at the end of their life that they never really got the thing they were looking for. Yeah. Maybe they spun off some interesting insights and papers and books as part of the process, but it's a widely attested perception and experience that the thing you're seeking is always eluding you, and you're always failing to kind of hit that bullseye. We never really hit that bullseye. Rationality makes a certain kind of progress, and in science, you can have a certain kind of accumulation of bodies of knowledge. But the ultimate phenomenology of rational truth seeking is always this kind of failing to hit the precise target, but hopefully getting something somewhat illuminating as a byproduct, which you then write down, and the history of intellectual life kind of proceeds in that way. Yeah. So to me, I do sometimes think about the religious mysteries as a way of encoding this fact of reality in a way that is extremely sophisticated and compelling intellectually. Because if that is true, that rational truth seeking is always at best just kind of circling around its target, making kind of incidental, incidental byproducts of trying to circle around the target, then it's kind of a genius move to pre-encode that fact as part of your essential kind of philosophy of life. Yeah. And so that's something I kind of think about a little bit. I don't know if that answers your question.
You did a great job thinking about it just now. That was pretty good, I thought. I can tell you what I got out of it. Yeah.
Okay, please.
Well, it's when you said, it was the pause. You're like, I love the pause, right? And then you came out and you talked about, well, in some sense, thinking about what I heard you say is like thinking about something, or you're going to go after it kind of as if you could hit the target. But then you realize that actually the target is always in some sense ineffable. And at best, you end up circling around it, right? You're circling around it. I thought about the notion of, you even used your hands this way, circling around it. And I started to think about like, well, this notion of circumambulating. Are you familiar with that term? Right? Jung talked a lot about that a lot of his work is, and that's why it's so difficult to read, is because he's just circling around these things. And I always got this sense that circling around something is where it's kind of like this. It's like, one, it's a participatory knowing, right? There's a way in which you're constantly addressing and being addressed by it all the time, and it's informing the circle that you're circling around. But yet there's this way in which the thing you're circling around becomes like revealed in a mystery, that in some way there's this sense that one is transformed by circling around it, right? And I also started thinking about, like you said something really, I think, profound about rationality itself, which would mean that maybe like rationality is a response to that mystery, right? Like, it's maybe not, we have mysteries and then we apply rationality, but what if rationality is like the mysteries, those mysteries are what call forth rationality into being in some sense. And I felt that in some way. And that's where this stuff gets really personal for me. Like, what's the connection between thinking about that thing? Where is that thing in relationship with myself that has me even see it in the first place? Or what level is it already unconcealed? Right.
Mm.
That's kind of what I got out of what you said.
Yeah, that's really thoughtful. I mean, what do you think about this? And I'm particularly interested in, because you alluded to, becoming quite a Heideggerian. Although I know Johannes admonishes us to not use the term Heideggerian. That
Yeah.
Heidegger did not want
Yeah.
Heideggerians,
Yeah.
but nonetheless, you know what I mean. So do
Mm-hmm.
you, you know, I'm curious to know a little bit more about like what was the real what was your Heideggerian awakening? Like, what was the major kind of upshot of your
Yeah.
that kind of that was most
Yeah.
fruitful for you?
Right. Is my sound coming through okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, cool. It's so funny. It's kind of it's well, right around the time we started circling, in a way that I didn't really make the connection at first. My friend David Niebauer had bought the basic writings of Heidegger. And I have reading disabilities and I have all kinds of learning disorders and all kinds of stuff like that. So like reading philosophy wasn't like something that, looked fun to me at all. And I didn't go to school for any of it. But something about what he was saying with being really just kind of glowed from the page. And so at the time I was going to the Art Institute. That's why I moved to San Francisco. And of course, I was a poor student. So, but I lived across the street from the Barnes and Nobles, down like right off the Fisherman's Wharf there, and uh, and I would, of course, no one bought the Heidegger books, right? So I would just go down there and drink coffee, and after class and stuff, at every point I could, I would just read the Heidegger books, and I didn't even know what Dasein meant for like the first week. I couldn't even parse that apart exactly. But there was I was hearing something that I couldn't understand that kept having me go through it. And I think I started to understand what that is in some sense the kind of the you could say the transformative requirement or sacrament that one makes in awakening philosophy, which I think Heidegger really is conscious of that in doing it, right? Of that I think what started to happen was I think in trying to understand what Dasein meant, right? I had to kind of like step so far outside of my own frame of reference to then look back and try to understand what he was saying, then fall over myself, right? Then start up and do it again and again and again and again. That in some sense, that was a kind of, it was a real philosophical practice, I think, that I started to realize had come through in ways that I didn't understand at first when we were developing circles. Of like, I started to see some of the Heideggerian language started to be in the actual culture around circling. And I was like, oh, very funny, Mr. Heidegger. Like he that something about the reading and what it took for me. And I also get that there's something going on with me in reading in the right brain that isn't. I didn't learn how to read till I was 11. So there's some mystery there with me and the way I read with my body or something, or with my right brain, that's kind of weird that I totally don't understand. Um, but then, yeah, I started to see, and then what, based on part of what I was seeing and the way things were starting to disclose and my response to them was a big part of the thing that circling ended up becoming through all of that. And I even thought it was like that I realized it after the fact was in some way more telling to me about what it was, right? In some way. So I would say that in that it was surprising, and that I went through it not at all in the academic world. This is one of the things that's been so exciting for me in the internet and having this YouTube channel is I've met all these people that have actually read some of the same books, right? And we can get to kind of talk about it. I didn't have that for the longest time, right? But it was on some level, I was informing me and learning how to listen, I think, ultimately. Because I think, and my understanding is what I think what philosophers do more than even they would probably understand. I think what they're doing is that they're, to the degree that their philosophy and what they write is telling, right? Is lights up as what it is, seems to be about their ability to listen, right? That they're responding to something, right? And in some sense, there's somehow, and then the major ones, the one that actually kind of like speak the ontotheology of the understanding of being itself, are the ones that somehow are listening to those things, and they just bring it into language for the first time. But like being a philosopher seems to be more about listening than it is about even writing or speaking, right? It seems to be
Mm.
about perceiving, right, and tuning into the culture. So in that sense, and given that circling is completely about listening, right, a lot about listening, I think that's where it connects as well in the practical world for me.
That's very cool. That's really cool. Yeah, I like what you said a little bit ago about lighting up. I like this expression of lighting up
Mm-hmm.
because I think listening can sound abstract and people can think, oh, well, I listen to people all day. I'm a fine listener.
Mm-hmm.
But I like this phrase light up because when you're really listening, you can get these kind of light bulb flashes, and it's quite a clear and specific kind of phenomenological
Mm-hmm.
state in a
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
And listening also sounds very altruistic, but it's almost selfish in a way. Like listening is actually almost it's actually
Mm-hmm.
almost the most selfish thing, because
Yeah.
when you're truly listening
Mm-hmm.
and the subject is able to light up in a moment, or something that someone says lights up and fills you with an insight or with an energy or an excitement or something like that. In a way, yes, you're obtaining that moment through a kind of selfless attention that you're paying to them,
Mm-hmm.
and a kind of emptying of yourself that you're paying to them, and a deference to what they're saying. But you're the one who's reaping the reward in a way, because you get to see that light up. You get to see the idea or the person or the object that you're listening to light up, and that's I mean that is the material out of which great insights are made and great works of art are made. And
Yeah.
so it's like listening, is
Yeah.
not this super abstract kind of vague process where you just stop your own mental processes to pay deference to someone else, which sounds like a snooze fest and just like an abstract
Yeah.
thing. But it's
Yeah.
actually attuning yourself and preparing yourself to have your own maximally effective and intense and profound insights and ideas and
Yeah.
inspirations in a way.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's like, well, if you think of it phenomenologically, I think the common sense, you alluded to the common sense notion of listening. Listening is that thing that happens when I just shut my mouth when somebody else is talking, right? As if there was something just automatic about listening. But I can tell you from teaching people, like creating exercises and doing circling where you train people in like opening up to listening, over and over again, this is what I see, is people start to have this realization once they see it as a thing to get good at and aspire towards. One is they thought they were listening their whole lives, right? And in the moment, what they find out is that when they try to listen, they realize one, and this is so hard to see, it's so hard to get on so many different levels, but they realize like one, I've never listened. Not only have I like don't know how to listen, but I thought I was listening, and now I realize I was not listening at all ever. And when they have that insight, it's interesting. That's where listening begins, right? Because they, in some sense, start to hear that they haven't listened. They're listening to their own listening, right? And then you start to get, then that possibility opens up because then they're listening to listening, right? And then you start to get that there's a sense with listening where, in some way, it's not like you're giving me information and you're filling my head with dots of information. No, like in some sense, this is why you can't think a thought and listen to what I'm saying at the same time, right? Because thinking and listening are absolutely coupled. So to the degree that you're listening is on some level is to the degree that you're letting me speak and somehow you give over your thinkability and you follow the movement of what I'm saying and you recreate it in yourself. And some things well, this is where kind of it can be starkly transformative, right? In this sense, is that there are some thoughts that in order to think them, in order to kind of let them unfold as a thought in your mind through listening, you have to stand on different presuppositions in order to even have that thought. And once you start shifting around your presuppositions, then you start talking about the transformation of the way that you see things. Once that level opens up. And I think that's what starts to become possible in listening, right?
Yeah, totally. You're making me kind of reflect on how, I mean, I'm definitely historically, like my personality type and my historical demeanor, I'm generally a bad listener. Like I'm kind of the person you were describing a minute ago, who, has most of my life kind of seen listening as this kind of, annoying, burdensome social plaintiff's obligation, because I have like a pretty rapid mind and I have lots of ideas and thoughts, and I'm, narcissistic and, delusions of grandeur and all these kind of like personality pitfalls of intellectuals. I have them all. I'm obsessed with myself, obsessed with my own brain. I think I'm the greatest thing since sliced bread. I have all the best ideas. Listening to other people is just like a waste of my time, and it's boring, and I only do it to be polite, more or less. Like if I'm honest with myself, like a lot of my, especially my earlier kind of like young adult life, definitely that type of person. But it is rather profound to realize that the greatest thinkers and the greatest artists and creators have generally been executing whispers that they have heard from something or from somewhere or from someone, and you only really get that through a kind of listening, which you alluded to before, because your brain can easily just throw up ideas all the time, and some of them might be interesting and fun to explore and to express or whatever, but you will run out. That will run out. It will either run out, or it will make itself vacuous by it'll kind of like spin out this increasingly self-referential hollow type of thing, unless it's genuinely integrating with other things in the world, basically. And you're never going to really emit something truly profound that connects with the rest of the world and impacts the rest of the world if it's not through a genuine allowing of the world to enter you. And and when you see it that way, it's like listening to someone talk in an authentic way where, you're sitting around a table or a cocktail party or doing a podcast like this or whatever, like actually really learning to slow your inner monologue, and you're really just listening to the words that they're saying and trying to, as you alluded to, almost you let them be the thinking in your own brain. Like it's like you're allowing you're giving your brain power to the other person's words as if those are the words you're formulating in your head, and you're wearing them for size. You're trying them for size. You're actually, thinking what you're hearing. You're allowing the person that you're listening to do the thinking for you. It is extremely rewarding when it's hard. It takes effort and patience and like you have to have like a certain amount of willpower to do it. Kind of just like meditation. It's like, meditation is on the one hand, on the one hand, it's almost the definition of easiness because it's like a cultivated not doing in a way, but it does take some practice and effort to get there in a way. I think true listening is similar, but you do find it in this paradoxical way. It's very rewarding because, it's almost bizarre. It is kind of bizarre. And actually I'm doing it more now since we're talking about it. And I'm kind of struck by how like different it is. This conversation with you, since you're priming me to pay more attention to it, I'm actually kind of struck by how in a lot of podcast interviews, like I'm not listening half as well as I could, because what you're usually doing is you're preparing your next comment while you're listening. And in some ways, you feel like that's being a good podcaster because you're like, you want to make sure the audience has interesting stuff like on a,
Yeah.
Rapid, consistent basis. But while you're preparing your next thought and you're not listening,
Mhm.
you're actually kind of selling short the what the conversation could really be if you just are
Yeah.
truly listening. And then when they're done speaking, you just say whatever comes next.
Yeah.
Like, it's hard to do, but it
Yeah.
is cool. And it is probably ultimately the more profound and impactful kind of method if
Yeah.
your goal is to really produce new knowledge or like genuinely creative new
Yeah.
possibilities.
Yeah. And what I'm seeing, what I'm hearing you say is one of the, I'm glad you noticed that, because I was just going to say, man, so from the place that I'm sitting, where you're sitting, the whole thing, it's like something's happening on its own. That's what it feels like. Something, connections are being made on its own. Something's happening on its own. In some sense, you heard, what I heard you say is you heard in some way that you went on a ride with listening, went, oh, I guess that's, and in some sense, you took my thought and then you rethought it, but then again, I was hearing my thought be thunked by you as I'm listening to it. And there's this something about this kind of this midwifery, right? Is what Socrates talked about, that like really, like
Yeah.
he it's listening as midwifery, which is interesting because midwives in antiquity both made the connections, right? They went out and found each other to get married, and then they birthed the result of the child, right? So to think about it in that sense, right, that's huge. But
Mm-hmm.
there's also this way in which there's the interrelational thing that happens, which is so neat, I think, where that if you want to become a better speaker, then in a certain sense, all speech only happens, like it's ontologically always prior to listening. Like it's hard to imagine how speech would ever become speech without a listening that in some sense required it to do so, right? So in some sense, all speech really is a declaration to what I just heard, right? Or it'll reveal the attunement. So that's one of the things I've noticed, is that people who are actually really good speakers, usually they got that thing about listening, right? And because once you got that thing about listening, it becomes spontaneous in being attuned to the other person or to the topic or whatever is really happening, right?
I have a question for you. What about though when you're listening carefully and then the person is done talking? And so don't you sometimes have nothing to say because you were listening so closely? Does that ever happen to you? And what do you do with that?
Well, it depends on the context, right? It depends on the context. If there's a context, right, where, like, say it's a circling context, then it becomes interesting, right? Because then we can go like, well, what kind of not saying, right? Like, what kind of not saying are we not saying right now, right? We can explore, like, was it just me not listening? Was it like you didn't say it, you weren't 100% in what you said, right? You can kind of explore, you can explore the very silence of it, right? However, from, like, I would say my aspiration as like an interviewer, right, or a dialoguer in this domain, which I'm imagining is one of the things you maybe were asking about, it's kind of like on some level, I think I do take it more from the sense of like, I, in some level, yeah, I like what they said has not conceived, right, in me, right? Notice the metaphor, conceive, right? So there's a way in which I could fault that to my own listening, right? I didn't listen totally as deeply as I could, or because on some level, what you want to do, it seems like, is like, because you're hearing what they're saying, but there's also this level where you can start to hear at deeper levels of listening. This is one of the things I've noticed, in that way that I think Heidegger talks about, that human beings are already always in a response underway and responding to something they don't totally understand, right? Like, um, and that listening somehow is that you can actually listen so deeply where I no longer just hear what you're saying, but I hear not even like what you're saying, but the fact that you're saying it the way that you're saying it, what you're in response to, right, that you don't totally understand, and you can start to hear that, right? And that's where it becomes really, really interesting, right? To me, is like where you say XYZ, and I'm like, you care about, pizza, and you've right. So of course you'd feel traumatized. It's like, I never thought pizza, but oh my god, you heard it, right? So there's like there's levels and layers to it.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense because I struggle with this as a podcaster because there have definitely been times where I try to be listening and then they'll be done with what they're saying and I'll have nothing to say. And
Yeah,
that's just kind of bad in terms of performance, in terms of podcaster performance, in terms of like trying to create the most interesting, rewarding, insightful audio content. That can be a bad thing. And but I think what I'm hearing from you now that maybe makes sense to me is if you're really listening, maybe what that means, you're not just completely emptying yourself and like taking each of their words one word at a time and just reflecting on each one of their words at the same time. But maybe what really listening is like you said before, kind of allowing their words to be your own internal monologue, and you're actually practicing and thinking through their words as they say them, as if they were in your own brain. But maybe to add to that, what you're actually also doing when you're listening at your absolute best is you're creatively anticipating what comes next in a way, or not anticipating, because that would maybe sound like it's kind of confining where they're going or prejudging them. But it's more like as you're listening, you're looking for implications that unfold from it. And you're kind of scanning like the next continuation. You're scanning like what other attractive things open up from what the person is saying.
Yeah.
And so I guess maybe in an ideal listening situation, like for a podcast or something like that, you're not thinking about your next thought. You are truly only paying attention to what they're saying. Yeah. But theoretically, they could stop at any point in time and you would have already in your mind one or two next things to say that basically flow from what you're hearing.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I was just catching wind of just that, again, so we're inside of something's present that you noted, like, oh shit, like there's this awareness of listening. But I also noted, like, as you were talking, you were like, all right, you're at the edge of what you could tell, like you're just at the edge, and both of us found out what you were going to say, right, as you were saying it. And I felt like with you, it's like, oh, you're bringing in the horizon of all these situations, and you're like, oh, actually, like, and then you said the thing about the listening that, oh, actually, if I'm really listening, I'll always, given that it's conceiving, I'm letting them think me, right? All I have to do is pick up on anything that they said, right? And bring it back into the conversation, right? That sense of making, right? Like the sense of that way that conversations can open up a horizon, right? And then we can both start to circle around it, right? And make sense of it together. And then somehow that's the way that these kinds of conversations seem to become more than the sum of the two people, right? That's what I've come to call dialogos.
That's fantastic. Yeah. You said something a moment ago about being able to refer back to any part of what they said. That's also interesting because one's own desires and personal interests come into play here in a way, because when you're really listening, once the person is done talking, to be a good interlocutor, it's not like there's some optimal response that you're looking for. I think that's one possible mental model people might have is like, okay, if you're a really good listener, you're paying close attention, you've comprehended everything they've said, and then as soon as they're done talking, you should have some judgment of what's the most valuable thing I can respond with, or something like that pays the most, loyalty to the nature of what you just heard. But that's actually wrong. And if you think like that, you're often they're gonna be done talking, and you're gonna have nothing to say, because who knows what the right thing, who knows what the optimal response is, or what the most, valuable contribution is in return. But actually, that's not the right mental model, because if you're listening, any one word that they said could trigger something in that's worth exploring.
Right.
So all you're really doing is like you're listening, and you're like scanning for potential value in what you're hearing. But you bring to the table, like, your originality is selecting what is interesting from it.
Yes.
You know what I mean? So it's like, and it can be anything. It can be anything. So that's kind of insightful, I think.
Right. Total. It's just kind of like, on some level, it's what you picked up on in listening, and what listening meant, right? To imagine this is before you ever did a podcast, right? Like, on some level, your history with doing podcasts, right, just came into view, and like you somehow you brought that frame into it, right? Of like, oh, this is how I can do during podcasts, right? And that's something that you brought into this discussion about listening, right? That was a response where you brought your own frame to it, right? And enriched it, I'd say.
That's right. I think you might have to do a kind of like podcast methodology or something like that out of this.
Totally. Because I think they call it. I think they call it circling.
No, right. I'm aware. I'm intuiting that. I get that, but you could probably just frame it slightly for podcasters in a way, because it is pretty interesting, like, reflecting on this, because my podcast is like something like 120 episodes, and I've never really reflected very seriously on this stuff, and so I suspect, like, the overwhelming majority of people who do podcasts don't have any particularly coherent or cogent self-understanding of what they actually are doing. You know what I mean? Like, I really don't. I never have, and I don't even think I'm particularly bad at it. I don't think I'm particularly good at it either, to be perfectly honest. But it is kind of interesting, because you basically are kind of supplying here, and I guess we kind of just somewhat like co-produced a fairly specific, like, set of guidelines, kind of, for like how to think about the listening versus the pressure and obligation to have like a next comment. Like, everything we just kind of said is actually pretty direct and useful, that I think probably a lot of podcasters could benefit from. So like, just kind of reframing it and pitching it for podcasters could be really cool for people.
It would be. Yeah, maybe we should talk about it. But it would also be interesting to, like, say, if you look back on all of the podcasts that, like, of all your podcasts, what are the ones that, like, where it just you enjoyed the most, right, in doing them, versus the one that you enjoyed the least? And you, like, looked at the differences. I bet you could probably see some distinctions like this, right, in them.
Totally.
Right.
Totally.
And I think there's something about this thing about letting yourself in some way be affected, right? Like, even be changed on some level by what you hear, right? Like, and then showing that in what you think in the conversation in some way displays that change that seems to bring a presence. Presence is something in the conversation. I think it presents the horizons. It changes the intimacy level. It changes the sense of safety between two people, and it seems to open up a lot more creativity and playfulness. The logos, right? Because ultimately, what we could always hear more of is the logos.
Playfulness. It's scary, I think, is the problem, especially when you're doing recorded stuff. It's very hard to not do the pre-preparing my next thought thing. Like, as I'm thinking about it, I always do that. Like, the truth is, I'm always I'm listening, kind of, but I'm mostly preparing my next thought. I would say that's probably like 90% of every podcasting hour I've done. Like, I'm so guilty of that in like thinking about it, being honest about it.
Right.
And I think what it comes down to is it's just hard. It's like, well, it's scary. It's really scary, because if you're really not preparing your next thought, and they stop speaking, you have to just trust whatever is, like what we were saying before, whatever is that next implication.
Yeah.
And you don't really know what it's going to be in advance.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I guess it does make it more fun though. And it should, in theory, probably make it more, the feeling of connection and authenticity should, in theory, be stronger and more rewarding, probably. But it is kind of scary because you can't be sure.
Yeah. And there's the scariness. Say more about what's scary. Like I know exactly what you mean, but I don't know if I've ever really thought about exactly what is scary about that. Does it expose something about me? Does it expose something about them? It's
It's it risks exposing something about yourself that you don't even know you're going to expose. That's the risk, because the instinct to prepare your next thought while the person is speaking, I think that instinct is overwhelmingly a kind of fear reducing, anxiety reducing, self protecting instinct where it's the instinct where you want to look good, you want to look smart, you want to provide value, you want to perform well and be judged well and be liked and admired, and all though that basic kind of social performance instinct is essentially trying to hide whatever is ugly about you and whatever is less than impressive about you. And so when you're really, really, really listening and you're laser focused on nothing but responding to what you're hearing in this kind of radically sensitive way, rather than a radically like prepared and strategic way, the risk is maybe your organic response is actually ugly. Maybe it's actually dumb. Maybe it's actually stupid or incomprehensible, or it wastes someone's time. And that's the fear, I think. And so by preparing your thoughts in advance, you can make sure, every minute I'm speaking in this podcast, I'm going to sound pretty good. I can guarantee that pretty much by preparing my thoughts in advance. But then those thoughts are not actually even in a genuinely living relationship with what you're hearing from the other person.
And especially when you think about what a conversation is me not even knowing what I'm going to say. Right? That's basically what a conversation is, right? It's hard to rehearse a conversation because there's so much ambiguity. The thing I just speaking to that one thing, one that kind of I one of the things I've noticed through circling and looking at this is that a lot of idle talk, right? Which is just kind of the spinning habitual things. You can just tell when somebody's doing that, right? And we need a lot of that, right? Because it's if we have too much novelty, we're scared shitless, But when we want, in some sense, when we want to invite what is beyond us through us, right? Through a conversation, that starts to enter out of something other than idle talk, right? And so there's a couple things that's just kind of present there. There's something about listening, right? There's something about the risk, right? There's something about the risk of like, well, why I don't listen maybe is because so I know what to say next. And what happens if I don't know what to say? And then there's something really risky about that. Like it feels like, like someone it's exposing, right? So I noticed that there's a big difference between the sense of being vulnerable. I want to put something else in there, like there's something about there's a difference between this distinction that usually gets confused between being exposed and being vulnerable, right? Exposure is usually what I think of that has me be afraid of being vulnerable, right? Which is the surprise, pants down, small penis, they all saw it. Uh-oh, I'm humiliated. I'm going to go, whatever, right? Vulnerability is that other way in where I'm actually consciously moving towards what is going to reveal me, right? And it's funny because those kinds of conscious acts usually are the very things that end up building our character, right? And revealing ourselves, right? So I think there's also this interesting relation between exposure and vulnerability that happens here that we can maybe invite. That I think if you're honest, most, yeah, you're saying you're right. Usually at some point there's some, when we're kids, there's some break in belonging, right, where I become identified as an other for the other, and then so I just spend my whole life making sure that I look a certain way in your head, and that's how I decide what to do, right? um, Out of terror. But then there's something about, like, if we can get a conversation that goes beyond that, then we start to break into, like, actually maybe finding out what we really think, right? The safety and the rapport back and forth starts to open up to where we can have, you can say my thoughts for me in ways that I never even thought of. And we start to go beyond something that transcends both of us, right? And it could also even transform both of us in some way.
Something that transforms both of us, exposure, vulnerability.
Courage.
You know, it also goes back to mystery, which we talked about before,
Yeah.
because I think when you're really listening, in a weird way, things become more confusing because to make sense out of things, to understand what someone is saying, you really have to assume a lot.
Mm.
And if you're really open, if you're really listening with an open mind, every word becomes this kind of question mark in a way that, like, if you're not over determining it and you're not overly imputing things to the person and you're really trying to just listen and respond openly and authentically, what I find, as I'm trying to do it extra purposely now that we're really talking about it, it's like everything becomes a little bit more fascinating, but in a way that is hard to it's like harder to process in a way. And so like what I'm kind of driving at here is, it's like, if you try to practice this kind of radical listening, like in everyday life, like I go to a cocktail party tonight and I meet a new person and they say that, they work on, they say they're a plumber. And I just think, like, plumbing, what is plumbing really? You know what I mean? I could see, if I were to really try to operationalize what we're talking about in
Yeah.
everyday life,
Yeah, totally.
I would become this kind of bumbling idiot in the technical sense,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
but is this a feature or a bug? Because maybe this would be
Yeah.
cool. Maybe this is
Yeah.
actually like an interesting way to be and a good way to
Yeah.
be. Because what you might actually be doing is, like, you're basically opening your aperture like crazy. And so you, maybe this kind of ethics and this kind of way of living, maybe you would come off like a bumbling idiot,
Yeah.
but maybe the world would become radically more informative. Like maybe the value of going to a cocktail party now in this new mode is actually going to leave me with a ton of new data that is, like, profoundly impactful on building my own, like,
Yeah.
original mental model of the world. Do you know
Right.
what I mean?
Right. Right.
And
Right.
maybe even in a weird way, maybe it even becomes kind of endearing and people like it, because it's like you would really be very strange if you really, like, went all in on practicing this.
Yeah.
You would really
Yeah.
become a strange kind of,
Right.
like, muttering, like,
Yeah.
philosopher weirdo.
Right.
And maybe this is
Right.
actually a good. Maybe this should. Maybe I want this to be brand more and
Yeah.
more that I think about it.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah. This is so. That's really, actually, I know a bunch of people like that.
Yeah, I bet.
But it's funny. Like that sense of just, remember too. There's this paradox with listening, right? Because in some sense, when they speak to you, they're also revealing what they understand, what they've heard about you, right? So to the degree that their speech is in response to you, you it, they're speaking into your listening, but you're also kind of getting a sense of their listening, right? So there's also this attunement factor, which I think that you're onto with this, of like I don't want to be rude and just sit there and just kind of like masturbate, like when whatever, the concept's so cool. but there's a way in which I'm actually attuned to them. And I think one of the things I was thinking about, what I think the way that this works, and like when we have people practice circling, listening and circling, is just the thing about just paying attention for a period of time, of just making sure that you understood what they said. So you just paraphrase it. Like, so you just take their idea. That's what I did in the beginning of this. And I realized, like, now that we're putting our attention on, I realized that, yeah, I guess I do this at first, until it drops into something else that starts to happen on its own, which like this conversation did, which was just like, oh, okay, so what you mean by this and that, was that right? And you're like, oh, okay, yeah, I guess that was right. And I kind of added something implicitly on that, right? And so a lot of it wasn't necessarily, it was just me letting you think my thoughts and then just taking them at first and just summarizing what I heard you say. And then by the end of that walk, I'm actually left not at blank. I'm like left with one. I can say, did I get it? Is that what you're talking about? Or I usually end up walk myself into, I didn't realize I had a question about this, and I'm interested in the thing that just opened up through hearing that, right? And I can ask a question about that. So there is a kind of a sense of like a safe porting, if you will, someone into this, or honoring a
Yeah.
process.
Now, do you think that also inclusive within this philosophy of deep and genuine listening?
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that there also could be a surprisingly wide number of legitimate responses that would seem to the other person as like insanely out of the blue.
Yeah.
You know, because here's what I'm here's what I'm thinking. Like,
Yeah.
as I'm trying to now that we're talking about this, I'm basically trying to do it like as like well as possible, and I'm just kind of observing how it's working.
Mm-hmm.
And something I'm realizing is as I'm listening to you like with true attentiveness, my absolute best.
Yeah.
And we both agreed, and we talked about how you in a genuine, authentic response,
Mm-hmm.
you can seize on who knows what aspect of what they said, as long as it's genuinely flowing from what they said. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But what if what you genuinely respond to is like a surprisingly minute detail in like,
Yeah.
you know, how like the person's right eyebrow goes up or down when they say a certain word, right?
Yeah.
And so it's like you might say something really profound and valuable about
Mm-hmm.
the nature of speech, and my response is, Guy, is there something weird about your right eyebrow?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like that's a
Yeah.
totally random
Yeah.
example, by the way, that I
Yeah.
don't see anything notable about your eyebrow, but
Yeah.
you see what I'm saying? Like the
Yeah.
authentic, truly attentive response could see it, like you might
Yeah.
think Justin's not even listening to me. He's talking about something totally different.
Yeah.
But in
Yeah.
fact, it could be my most attentive response is something that
Yeah.
seems like it comes way out of the blue that almost sounds like I'm not listening.
Right. Totally. I can totally get it. Like on some level, you could. What I would imagine I'd say is like, in fact, I think what I have said when it's like this, it's been. I think what I've said is like, I, I, on some level, I'm really interested in what you just said, but actually, what moved me was your left eyebrow as you were talking. Like, what's happening with your left eyebrow? Like, I'm fascinated with why you twitch that way when you said that. Why am I interested in that? Right.
Right. Right. I'm just wondering if this is like, if you agree that this is within the philosophy of good listening,
Yeah.
or if
Here's
it's like,
here's
yeah.
here's the thing about it, is that there's also a relationship that you're tending to that I actually appreciate, right? What you're talking about, that there is social etiquette to a certain degree. Like
Mhm.
you can agree to break it as long as you're willing to feel humiliation, right?
Mm.
Like if you want to just feel like you've just ended people's lives, like go to Starbucks and just lay on the floor, right? Just imagine that. Like you can just, I blush just thinking about that. You're not doing anything really crazy. You're just laying on the floor. But everyone's
Right.
going to be like, oh, how could he just lay on the floor? And your super ego is going to be just like, you are such a bad person. Why are you laying on the floor? Right. So there
Right.
are these social regularities that I would say that as I've gotten older, I've come to really deeply appreciate, right? Like it's like manners and social structures, and you say something when I say something, and that there's a dance. In some level, like that's how we've learned how to live with like 9 billion strangers, right? If we
Mhm.
didn't have those signaling things, there's something very deep going on in those little rituals that I didn't appreciate when I was younger. Um, but I somehow feel more appreciative as I'm older. So I think what I'm responding to is whatever it is that had a concern, like that you were concerned about, like, oh yeah, but what happens if I listen so deeply and then I just don't have anything to say afterwards? Like there's something also I hear in that is a courtesy. There's a courtesy that you have in the relationship and it being comfortable and having a certain level of rapport and like making sure the person is having there. At least for me, I really give a fuck about like whether or not they're having a good time, right? And so that's part of being in response to them, right?
Right.
And so there's ways where I'm more apt to like that this where we're talking now, this way of talking is where actually any conversation can go if in some way there is a invitation into that world, they'll do it with you, right? Like, and you can actually safe port them into the conversation, right? In a response.
Right.
But I could totally see like, and I have been like that. I am like that most of the time where I'm just like, especially if I don't give a shit, right? There's a sense in which like, if I'm just honest, I just want to, have sex with your legs as you just said that, right? Or whatever, right?
Right. Yeah, it's fascinating this like distinction between when are you being a dick and you're kind of like, you're just being kind of yeah, a dick, or you're being kind of like thoughtfully contributing a
Yeah.
kind of like creative energy into
Yeah.
the dialogue or
Yeah.
the situation,
Yeah.
right? And I think what I'm hearing from you about, what was the word were you saying, safe boarding?
Safe porting. There's a
Safe
note. Yeah,
porting,
it's I
meaning
don't know where that comes from. But it's safe porting, meaning it's like, oh, you're aware that the person has some expectations, probably has some expectations. They've never done this world. Like you're kind of hosting them into a different space, right? And giving them time to kind of get, oh, we're in a different law of physics here. There's just a sense of having an eye on the person's safety. Because on
right.
some level,
So
to open up in creativity seems to be a function of safety in a lot of ways.
right. So that's right. So
Or
safe
play it
porting.
does.
Yeah,
Play
that's
at
interesting.
least does,
So
yeah.
that maybe is the what distinguishes like being a kind of aloof, like bumbling dickhead versus
Mhm.
being like a fun, interesting, creative, like dialogue partner, is
Mm.
whether or not you're paying attention to
Mm.
the what you're calling safe porting, or what you in some sense just basically attending to
Yeah.
the larger um, kind of surrounding ambient signals in a
Yeah.
way. So like you you want to be not just listening to what they're saying, or the kind of like the sheer data of like their body and speech, but you actually want to be listening to the situation and its
Yeah.
data, kind of,
Yeah.
or you need to
Yeah.
at least like minimally
Yeah.
integrate into your mental processing like the
Yeah.
an ensemble of incoming signals,
Yeah.
their speech,
Uh-huh.
their physical presence,
Yeah.
but also one or two data points about like this person's social rank and your
Yeah.
time of knowing them and that
Yeah.
kind of thing. So
Yeah.
that, I guess, if you're really listening to the situation
Yeah.
fully, then
Yeah.
that should prevent like bad form in this sort of
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if you're listening to the situation correctly, and um,
Mhm.
you will naturally safe port them. You will organically kind of safe port them
Yeah.
into your weird questions.
Totally. Like, was Deleuze for who? What was the philosopher where the light bulb turned on for you? Was it Deleuze or was it who? Was there a moment in which where you were
When
like,
you say
"Ooh"?
the light bulb, what do you mean by the? Because I mean, I've had many light bulb moments in my day. So what do you mean by the light bulb?
Like where you were like, "Oh, what I just read, everything's different from now on." Like in that
Honestly,
sense
my
of
answer
like,
is My answer is like a pretty cliche one, but it was Nietzsche when I was,
Oh
like
yeah.
18.
Okay, got you. And so, is it fair to say that like Nietzsche, like I just want to check this out, that on some level, Nietzsche, in reading Nietzsche, was it that he affected you like that? Was it in some sense that in some way what he wrote thought your thoughts? That you actually was that was a deep encounter of listening to Nietzsche?
Maybe. I mean, in retrospect, I want to say that when I was 18, I probably didn't have any particularly good thoughts. So I don't,
Yeah.
yeah, I feel like
Or awakened you to
oh,
thinking.
I read Nietzsche and he was
Yes.
saying all the things I thought
Yeah.
almost feels a little bit preposterous.
Right.
But maybe there was a kind of feeling of that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I guess what I would
Oh, you
I
broke
keep
up for a
imagining.
second.
Oops. Let's see. Hang on a second.
You're frozen to me. I don't know if you're hearing me.
Oh, I try to be just emotionally frozen. Hang on. Um, oops. Cool. I think mostly what I'm getting at is it seems whatever it was that awokened, I'm imagining, right? Because for me, it was reading Heidegger. So maybe I'm just projecting that on you, right? But I'm imagining,
Mm.
I was imagining this like to be an intellectual. What's the possibility of intellectual and you being one and seeing yourself as that? Was it, how did that happen for you? How did that awaken in you? Uh-oh, can we see it?
Mm. Sorry, you froze again. I don't know if this is you or me or what, but
Okay, think it's you. I think it's
okay.
you. Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that.
I
Been
can hear you just fine now.
we've been perfect for almost 2 hours, so
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know what's. I have Ethernet, so it should not be unstable. But
Yeah, me too.
so I missed whatever you said last. If you want to try again.
Yeah, just like I'm just curious about like what was given this conversation, right? And kind of in a certain sense, right? Like I think where we started talking about listening was when I was talking about like my experience with Heidegger and that being a kind of awakening experience that went on. I'm just curious, like just from after this conversation, listening, just maybe conceiving it, looking at through this frame, like what was it that awakened you to be an intellectual,
Honestly,
if it was anything?
honestly, it's pretty cliche and immature, but trying to be really honest, my best memory. I mean, I have very specific memories, almost of like the table I was sitting at on campus at my university. I was about 18 or 19 or something like that, maybe 20.
Mm-hmm.
I have a fairly specific memory. It's kind of weird actually. And now I don't know if anyone's ever asked me this, so I'm not sure I've ever told the story. It's not that interesting in its own right, but I do actually have a very specific memory of like sitting at a particular table on a particular day, thinking to myself, this is so cool that there are people in history who basically just set their goal as to basically call bullshit on all the lies that define society, basically.
Yeah.
And that, like, clearly society runs on a certain number of lies.
Yeah.
And there are people who basically just decide that it's going to be their life goal to call bullshit on those lies as aggressively and as fully and completely as possible and let the chips fall where they may. And I just remember, mostly with Nietzsche, it was through Nietzsche, and you always have to be suspicious of these memories. This might be some combination of a dream and a memory. I don't know, but I have a surprisingly specific like image in my mind. It's like sitting at a particular table on my campus at Temple University, reading Nietzsche and having the thought that I just described.
Yeah,
and then basically thinking, I'm going to do this, basically.
Right.
Oh, and the final additional thought that I would put in a package with this kind of light bulb moment was specifically remembering as part of the same intuition,
Mm.
that society to reproduce itself has a lot of very clear built-in mechanisms
Mm.
for discouraging this kind of truly reckless truth telling,
Mm.
and seeing kind of in an instant,
Mm.
oh wow, our society reproduces itself by pretty much preventing individuals from calling bullshit in this
Yeah.
radically provocative way.
Yeah.
And yet throughout the ages, every generation there's a few people who do it anyway. And that was my insight. And I was like, okay, I'm going to try to figure out how institutions, I'm going to try to figure out, I'm going to set myself the goal of figuring out how institutions prevent individuals from calling bullshit on the lies.
Right.
I'm going to figure out how those mechanisms work, and I'm going to do it. And the final thing I'll add, because it's kind of all just coming back to me, is specifically also remembering like, wow, Justin, if you're right about if this basic intuition you're having is correct, then you better prepare, Justin, because as you try to do this, there are going to be many, many times and points along the way where the system's going to try to make you sell out, and you're going to be confronted with that temptation consistently over time. But you need to harden your soul now and prepare for when those junctures come, so that you don't get sucked into the system and you don't get tempted into selling out on this. And I just remember like kind of hardening myself mentally, like, okay, I see it coming. The system is going to try to, pacify me. Right. But mark my words, I see how it's happening now when I'm young, and I'm not going to let them fucking get me. I remember thinking everything I just said. I swear to you, I remember having all of those thoughts. Yeah. Like one day at a table reading Nietzsche. I'm not even kidding.
Wow. Hey, I just want to I just want to give homage to that moment right there.
It's awesome to rethink that. It's really awesome to rethink that. So I'm flattered and honored by the question. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to go down that memory lane.
Yeah, totally. Because in some sense, what I heard you say is it was all there from the beginning.
I kid you not. It really was. It
you
really
just
was.
described everything that you talked about with the future and everything, and all the way to what you're doing now. Like something happened.
Yeah, and you know what? I don't want it to sound like delusions of grandeur or anything like this. I think like anyone who wants to pursue an artistic or intellectual life has had this kind of feeling probably at some point in time. They've had this kind of intuition, and this is what it means to have a calling. This is what a calling is really. And I think the intellectual life is a very specific calling. And I think what I'm describing, any true intellectual has had this kind of feeling or intuition or calling. Yeah. It may be in their own words, in their own way at some point in their life, but I think I'm testifying to a thing that is not particularly common. I don't think a majority of people have this experience. Mm-hmm. But I think a non-trivial number of the genuine artists, of the genuine thinkers, the genuine, what I call, the intellectual, most people can attest to something like this in their life, some kind of moment or insight or calling of this nature. So I don't think I'm some, super unique genius or anything like that. But I do think that this is kind of the defining characteristic of the true intellectual.
Right. In that moment, it was just so telling. It's also, given it's Nietzsche, something so holographic about that, right? Because I would imagine, can you remember what book it was that you were reading? Do you remember it?
I can't exactly, but I can say that I remember the books of aphorisms always did much more for me. Mm-hmm. It could have been Ecce Homo, which is just like one of the most outrageous books ever written. And I remember just loving that book in particular. Right. I think that's my favorite book of his. Yeah. It's so insane and outrageous that it could very well have been that one.
Yeah, totally. Because there is a way that, like, I think that why the character of Nietzsche is why he has that, like, where other philosophers are profound, but you're not like inspired, right? Like, it's hard to be inspired by Kant or something, right? It's like, right. But Nietzsche was like fucking inspiring because it's in some sense he was doing that very thing that you were talking about. So I would imagine that you were reading. Well, this is where listening is, right? It's like you were like reading what he was saying, but you were also you were reading him demonstrate being someone saying that, or who could say that, right? So in some sense, I can imagine you really listened to Nietzsche in such a way that it presents the possibility that became the rest of your life in that moment, at least to prophesized it.
Yeah, something like that I think is is a plausible reading of that. It's fascinating. It's really fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think also what people like to make fun. I like using this word intellectual. The intellectual as a social type is very. I use it a lot, and I find myself referring to it a lot. And I sometimes wonder why, because a lot of people like to make fun of this. It sounds very pretentious, and and people, you know, people love to. Anyone who takes themselves seriously as an intellectual, people love to make fun of that type of person, right? It's like people will accuse you of all kinds of things: pretentiousness, delusions of grandeur, whatever, narcissism. But honestly, I think one of the reasons I like using this term as a kind of category or a social type is because true intellectuals will not be offended by this term. They'll know exactly what I mean. Like the real, like I have found in my judgment that the intellectuals who are the real deal know other intellectuals who are the real deal, and they just know that it's a fairly unique and specific kind of attitude and personality type, and calling. And it is pretty rare, relatively, not to sound elitist or anything, like just objectively, it's just a relatively rare thing that people are really afflicted by. It's almost an affliction, it's almost an affliction. And, I think if you're not a genuine intellectual, it sounds ridiculous and pretentious, and that's fine. Like they can call call me or other people whatever names they want.
Right.
But anyone who is a true intellectual, I think, immediately gets what I'm talking about and knows that there is a small cast of us that are afflicted with this like weird, unique thing. And and I have found that like the real deal usually announces itself pretty clearly. But it's only usually interpretable or legible to other people who are the real deal when it comes to this. And when I say the real deal, I don't even mean, high IQ or extremely well read or accomplished. I just mean like there is a personality type that is the true intellectual. And if you're in it, if you are that, you know it, and it when you encounter it. And if you're not that, it's always going to sound fake and pretentious because you don't know it. I think that's an observation I have.
And you know each other. You can just kind of tell. But it's hard to define. It's hard to reduce it down to anything, right? It's just it's a character type of some kind in some way.
Yeah. Well, so that's a secondary observation, but
there's a way that I'm not that familiar with Faust, but isn't the Faustian bargain essentially, or the wisdom of Faust, of why read that book, is basically what he's saying is like, look, intellect is not good at the top of the hierarchy or the center of the mandala, right? It's pretty good like a layer or two down, but you don't want that thing running the show, right? Isn't that basically the message of Faust?
Sure, I think so. I think that's perfectly well put and a true statement. I mean, I'm certainly no Faust scholar myself, so I shouldn't speak out of school, but I mean, to what I've always taken from it more is that it's the power of the intellect can get you really good things. But you will pay a price for those really good things, basically. Like basically just this awareness. To me, the main kind of message is this awareness that, the intellect is just this extremely seductive thing where it can get you really good things. And those things are really good. Like they are truly desirable, things like material wealth and power. And like these things are, it's not enough to say that those are false attractions. Like, no, they're real attractions. They're like actually really attractive things that the intellect offers you.
Right.
But you will pay a price for them.
Yeah.
And
is it fair to say, to complete that thought?
No,
Yeah.
I'm please.
Yeah, is it fair to say something like, and intellect ultimately is in service of something? Like there's something in which it's subordinate to, right? Or it's a what do you call it? It's a yeah, it's a there's something in which it's subservient to, that it serves, right? That and this is an interesting distinction, right? And I think this is what I appreciate about you that comes through in my experience of listening to you today and your work and stuff like that is like this kind of awareness of the place of the intellect, you know,
Right.
right? And I think one of the ways that you show that is in your humor, right? When you talk, kind of you self-aggrandize yourself, kind of half joking, right? About like, well, I am a arrogant, da da da, and you mean it, but you're also revealing and understanding, right? That yeah, and at the same time, I'm just a dork, right? Kind of fumble fucking my way through all of this, right? At the same time, so there's a tension there that I just want to like say I think I've heard in your work that I've ended up trusting you more
Huh.
in some of
I
your
like
work.
that, and
Yeah,
thank you very much for that.
yeah,
That's very lovely, and I see what you're saying. I definitely do believe that one of the greatest virtues of of the Christian faith is that it has this somewhat remarkable kind of anti-narcissism constraining effect. Or no, that's not even the best way to put it. It's like it gives you this shell in which you can pursue the wildest ambitions with the greatest energy and zeal,
mm,
and yet not become a full-blown megalomaniac.
yeah,
This is what I like about it,
yeah,
because
yeah,
the way that I think about this is, if you want to do something really big in life, right? You want to write the greatest philosophy magnum opus of your generation, or you want to make fundamental innovations in engineering, or you want to take the species to the moon or Mars or whatever the case might be. If you really want to set yourself really truly ambitious goals in your life of any kind, you kind of have to be somewhat narcissistic and somewhat megalomaniac, just to keep up the confidence to do it, right? Just to
right,
keep up the energy and the belief in yourself that you can do it, right?
right.
And so if you don't believe in God, but you want to do something great in life,
Mm,
you're almost bound to becoming a megalomaniac.
mm,
Or at
right,
least, maybe there's been some people who have
yeah,
avoided it, but it's a major hazard.
yeah,
Whereas if you truly believe in God and you truly pay homage to
yeah,
God, and
yeah,
and you genuinely think about it that way,
yeah,
you can set your eyes on extraordinarily ambitious goals
yeah,
and believe in yourself as being capable of doing them,
mm,
and also have a
yeah,
humble and realistic mental model of
yeah,
yourself
yeah,
as just an idiotic bumbling peasant,
yeah,
because you genuinely chalk it up to the greater glory of God, and you thank God for whatever blessings you might have that allow you to do something
right,
potentially important, but you genuinely don't take that much credit for it yourself,
yeah,
because you realize you're really just blessed with something else, from something else or from someone else. To me, that's one of the most profound and
yeah,
powerful, but also like equilibrating kind of implications of the Christian faith.
right. It's also just really kind of it harkens back to the earlier when we were just talking about the mystery, right? And you made this kind of distinction about like, well, we played with the sense of what this that like because the big thing, like instrumental rationality is like the thing that's kind of almost like the cancer, right? That's going on is this instrumentalizing basically metaphysical concepts and operationalizing them, and then just it has its own thing, and that's in framing. That's the whole. the whole fallenness of the world, if you will. What I think I think what we're pointing to is there is, but if we say that there is rationality in another sense, right, is called out to what is unsayable, right? That it in some sense, and as you're talking about, you circle around it and not say it, yet somehow reveal more of the mystery as such, right? In through rationality, where like it's a aspirational rationality versus an instrumentational rationality. And I think that's one of the things I've just appreciated about just in that sense in your work of like that. Yeah, there is a place where you're exalting an intellectual life on many different levels, yet there's something trustable about that, right? And I think that there's a one of the reasons I wanted to talk with you about now I'm realizing it as we're talking is that yeah, I'm like basically like yeah, that mystery that you end up circling around, right? Not really being able to say it, but it reveals itself. Yeah, is that the thing? is are you experiencing that too? Like underneath it all, is that what calls you to think and what calls you to, even without even knowing it, right? What calls you to be the intellectual in the way that you are?
Maybe,
Yeah,
maybe, but honestly,
well said.
listening to, well, just reflecting on what we've been talking about, honestly, and really letting our discussion of listening, like really letting that kind of integrate into what we're talking about now at this particular topic about like the intellectual calling and Christianity. And I'm actually honestly feeling authentically right now, like the answer to this question is I really don't deserve any credit for, like, I don't know. I don't really know. And I don't think, like, I think some people are blessed with certain like motivations and energies and ideas and callings, and some aren't. But it's like, I think I want to plead a more genuine and complete ignorance about, like, I don't know. I don't
Yeah,
know. It's
yeah,
tempting. It's tempting to say something more sophisticated, but
yeah,
I think ultimately I really don't.
yeah, 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 yeah.
And I also think it's not, I think a lot of people are really gifted and capable of pursuing extraordinary artistic or intellectual callings. And that really, the problem I think more people face that's more common is being able to peel away the things that are blocking them. This is something I think, like I don't think I'm that gifted when it comes to like philosophy or science or like the calling of pursuing the intellectual life. Like I get that I've been pretty unique and kind of somewhat uniquely successful in carving out a new niche and winning a certain kind of new game of how to be an intellectual in the digital age. But I genuinely, and it's not false modesty when I say I genuinely think I'm relatively unexceptional on most of the things that people think are really important. Like IQ, like in terms of IQ, I'm really nothing special. I'm somewhat gifted, but like I'm not super high IQ. I'm really not. And I'm fairly well read for like someone with a PhD, but I'm not extremely well read. So it's like all the things that people really admire and look up to. I'm really not very strong on any of them, honestly, is the honest truth. It's not false modesty. I think what I've been good at, and the reason I talk about this is not to talk about myself, but almost the opposite, to try to convey that the one thing I've been good at is actually, I think, something that's relatively accessible, which is learning to basically just peel away the layers of like psychological nonsense that that inhibit people from just going full speed at the thing that they feel called to go at. Do you know what I mean? And it's like, I think that's like somewhat empowering message, because like, I think there are lots of people that are just as high IQ as I am and have read, you know, more or less the same amount of books as I have, who like could be way more successful in terms of having a public impact with a unique intellectual message, and just basically carving out the minimum kind of little ecological niche for oneself that makes enough money that allows you to pretty much do your intellectual work full time, like over the course of your life. But the real thing is mostly just finding the fake kind of psychological anchoring points and biases and anxieties and fears that that in so many different ways make you always do something other than what it is you really like feel called to do. I think I've been uniquely good at like, removing certain blockages, but to me, that's like that's relatively reproducible. And, it's hard. It's really hard to give someone a higher IQ, and it's really hard to, make someone read more books or like make them remember more, sophisticated stuff. But like, I do think that there's a pretty widespread kind of just basically bad and false and inhibiting mental models that a lot of people have. And I think like it's just a matter of peeling those off your goggles in a way. And I guess I remain somewhat optimistic and somewhat egalitarian in that I think how to peel that stuff off the goggles is actually relatively easier, and it's easier to transmit, and it's easier to share and spread, because a lot of it is kind of social. It's like, people don't pursue certain things because it often boils down to some version of they're afraid what people are going to think, and it's going to be interpreted by certain people in the wrong way, and it's going to cause certain like social psychological perception issues. And those can get diverse and complicated, but that's kind of what it often boils down to, I think. And so what's cool to me is this is eminently engineerable, because it's a matter of, okay, just get a minimum critical mass of people who have the right ideas and a kind of shared psychological attunement to the truth, to truth seeking, to independent, creative intellectual exploration, and just basically, can we engineer structures that allow a larger number of people to like peel off, that those layers of gunk on the goggles? You know what I mean? And to me, it's like engineering social psychological structures that empower larger numbers of people to peel the gunk off their goggles is actually like very attainable and very, very possible in a way that like increasing people's IQ or giving them more books to read isn't. And that is kind of like, that's kind of the message I would want to leave you with, because you're asking a lot. I'm very flattered, and I'm very grateful that you appreciate what's kind of unique about me, and I'm very flattered, and that's cool. And it's nice to feel appreciated for sure. But it's not false modesty when I say that actually I really do think what makes me unique is really fairly mundane, kind of removal or subtraction of crap that for some